The bread crust fell from Clara Zimmerman's trembling fingers onto the wooden table of the dusty trail saloon, and she snatched it back so quickly that the movement caught the attention of the tall cowboy standing near the bar in Montrose, Colorado on that sweltering afternoon in July of 1878. Thomas Barrett had seen plenty of hungry folks in his 30 years, but something about the way this young woman carefully wrapped those dried bread edges in a faded handkerchief and tucked them into her worn carpetbag made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. Clara was 22 years old, though the hardships of the past months had carved lines around her green eyes that made her look older in certain lights. She had arrived in Montrose 3 weeks earlier on a supply wagon, fleeing from a failed engagement in Denver where her intended had gambled away not only his own money, but the small inheritance her parents had left her before succumbing to influenza the previous winter. She had nothing now except the clothes on her back, a few coins she earned washing dishes at the saloon, and the determination burning in her heart that she would survive this, that she would build something from nothing if she had to dig it from the Colorado earth with her bare hands. Thomas watched her from beneath the brim of his hat, pretending to study the whiskey in his glass. He was a cattle driver, spending most of his time on the trail between Colorado and Kansas, but he had been raised on a small ranch outside Montrose and still considered it home. His father had died 5 years back, leaving him the property, and his mother had remarried and moved to California 2 years after that. The ranch was his now, modest but profitable, with good grazing land and a creek that ran year-round. He had hands who managed it when he was away, and he always came back between drives with money in his pockets and restlessness in his soul. But right now, watching Clara Zimmerman save bread crusts like they were gold coins, Thomas felt something shift inside him. It was not pity exactly, though there was compassion in it. It was more like recognition, as if he was seeing something essential and true about human resilience, about the quiet dignity of someone refusing to break under the weight of circumstance. He drained his whiskey and walked out into the bright Colorado sunshine, his mind already working on a plan. The next morning, Clara woke in the tiny room she rented above the general store, so small she could barely turn around in it, but it was hers and it was clean, and the rent was just manageable if she kept working every shift the saloon would give her. Her stomach growled as she dressed in her only other outfit, a simple gray dress with careful patches at the elbows. She had eaten her saved crusts for breakfast, softening them in water to make them easier to chew, and she told herself it was enough, that she had survived on less. When she came down the narrow stairs to start her walk to the saloon, she nearly tripped over something on the landing. There, wrapped in clean cloth, was a loaf of bread so fresh she could see steam still rising from it in the cool morning air. Clara looked around, bewildered, but the street was empty except for a few early risers heading to the livery stable and the general store below. She picked up the bread, her hands shaking, and found a small piece of paper tucked into the cloth. The handwriting was neat and masculine. "Everyone deserves fresh bread." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. She did not know who had left this, could not imagine who in this town even noticed her enough to care, but the kindness of it hit her like a physical blow. She took the bread upstairs, cut herself 2 thick slices, and ate them slowly, savoring every bite of the soft interior and crispy crust. The rest she wrapped carefully to make last, already planning how she would ration it over the next few days. But the next morning, there was another loaf, and the morning after that, another still. By the 4th day, Clara was determined to discover her mysterious benefactor. She woke before dawn and positioned herself by the small window that overlooked the street, watching through the gap in the curtains. The sky was just beginning to lighten, painting the mountains to the east in shades of pink and gold, when she saw him. Thomas Barrett, the tall cowboy from the saloon, walking up the street with a cloth-wrapped bundle in his hands. He climbed the exterior stairs quietly, set the bread down gently, and was turning to leave when Clara threw open her door. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper in the pre-dawn quiet. Thomas froze, then slowly turned to face her. In the soft light, she could see him clearly for the first time. He was handsome in a weathered way, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, brown eyes that held both kindness and something guarded, and a jaw covered in a few days of stubble. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn denim and a shirt that had seen many washings but was clean and carefully mended. "Morning, miss," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "You have been bringing me bread," Clara said. It was not a question. "Yes, madam." "Why?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, and she watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to name. Finally, he said, "I saw you saving Crusts. Seemed like you could use something better." Clara felt her throat tighten. "I cannot pay you. I am not asking you to. I do not take charity." "It is not charity," Thomas said, and there was something fierce in his voice now. "It is one person seeing another person and deciding to do something about it. That is not charity. That is just being human." Clara stared at him, this strange cowboy with his bread and his fierce declarations, and felt something crack open inside her chest. "I do not even know your name." "Thomas Barrett. Folks call me Tom." "Clara Zimmerman." "I know," he said, and when she raised her eyebrows in question, he added, "Asked around." "Why would you ask around about me?" Thomas shifted his weight, looking uncomfortable for the first time. "Because I wanted to know if you were married or spoken for." The morning air suddenly felt charged with something Clara could not quite name. "I am not," she said quietly. "Not anymore." "Good," Thomas said, then seemed to realize how that sounded. "I mean, good that I can bring you bread without it being inappropriate. I should go." "Wait," Clara said again, and he stopped. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I do not have much, but I have that." Thomas smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face, and Clara felt her heart do something strange and unfamiliar in her chest. "I would like that very much." They sat in her tiny room as the sun came up, drinking bitter coffee that Clara had brewed on the small stove she shared with the other tenants, and they talked. Thomas told her about his ranch, about the cattle drives and the long months on the trail. Clara told him about Denver, about losing her parents and her intended, though she found the latter loss hurt less with every day that passed. They talked until Clara realized with a start that she was going to be late for her shift at the saloon, and Thomas walked her there through streets now bustling with morning activity. "Can I see you again?" Thomas asked when they reached the saloon door. "Properly, I mean. Not just leaving bread like some kind of outlaw." Clara laughed, and it felt good, felt like something she had not done in far too long. "I would like that. Tomorrow evening, I could take you to supper at the hotel restaurant. I work tomorrow evening. What is your day off?" "Sunday afternoon and evening." "Sunday it is, then," Thomas said, and Clara watched him walk away with her heart beating faster than it had any right to. The next few days passed in a blur of work and anticipation. Thomas still brought bread every morning, but now he stayed for coffee, and they talked about everything and nothing, learning each other in the quiet hours before the town fully woke. Clara learned that Thomas loved the ranch but sometimes felt lonely in the big empty house his father had built. Thomas learned that Clara had wanted to be a teacher before circumstances had derailed her plans, that she loved reading more than almost anything, and that she had a sharp wit that caught him off guard and made him laugh. By the time Sunday arrived, Clara was nervous in a way she had not been in years. She put on her best dress, which was not saying much, and tried to do something with her dark blonde hair that was always trying to escape its pins. When Thomas arrived to collect her, dressed in clean, pressed clothes with his hat in his hands, the look in his eyes made her feel beautiful despite her worn dress and scuffed boots. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Montrose, which still meant it was relatively simple by city standards, but to Clara, it felt impossibly grand. They sat by a window overlooking the main street, and Thomas ordered them both steak and potatoes and fresh bread with butter, and when the food came, Clara had to blink back tears at the abundance of it. "You all right?" Thomas asked, concern creasing his forehead. "Yes," Clara said, laughing a little at herself. "I am just not used to this much food anymore." Thomas reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "You will get used to it again. I promise you that." They ate slowly, talking between bites, and Clara felt something building between them, something warm and solid and real. When Thomas told stories about life on the cattle drive, about the endless sky and the restless cattle and the men he worked with, his whole face came alive with passion for it. When Clara talked about the books she had read, about the ideas and places that existed in her imagination, Thomas listened with an attention that made her feel heard in a way she had rarely experienced. After dinner, Thomas walked her slowly back toward the general store, taking the long way through the quieter streets. The summer evening was warm and perfect, with a breeze coming down from the mountains carrying the scent of pine and sage. They walked close together, not quite touching, both hyper-aware of the small distance between them. "I want to tell you something," Thomas said as they paused near a cottonwood tree at the edge of town. "I am not good with fancy words, but I need you to know that I think about you all the time. From the moment I saw you saving those crusts, something just shifted in me. I know we have not known each other long, but I would like to keep knowing you. I would like to know everything about you." Clara felt her breath catch. "I think about you too, all the time. You have been so kind to me, but it is more than that. When I am with you, I feel like myself again, like the person I was before everything fell apart, or maybe like a new person entirely, someone stronger." Thomas reached up and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "You were always strong, Clara. I just helped you remember it." She leaned into his touch, and then somehow they were kissing, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, and Clara felt like she was falling and flying at the same time. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Come out to the ranch," he said. "Next Sunday, let me show you my home." "Yes," Clara whispered. "I would love that." The week crawled by, every day feeling like an eternity, but finally Sunday came again. Thomas arrived with a horse and buggy borrowed from his foreman, and Clara climbed up beside him with her heart racing. They drove out of town into the rolling Colorado landscape, and with every mile Clara felt something loosening inside her, some tight knot of fear and worry beginning to unwind. The Barrett Ranch sat in a valley with mountains rising blue and magnificent to the east. The house was a solid two-story structure built from local timber, with a wide porch and flower boxes that were currently empty but clearly had been tended at some point. There was a barn and a stable, several corrals with horses, and in the distance Clara could see cattle grazing on the hillsides. "It is beautiful," Clara said as Thomas helped her down from the buggy. "It needs a woman's touch," Thomas said, then seemed to realize what that implied. "I mean, my mother used to keep it nicer. Since she left, I have done my best, but I am not much for decorating." Clara smiled. "I think it is perfect." Thomas introduced her to his two ranch hands, older men named Pete and Samuel, who greeted her with respectful nods and knowing looks that made Thomas blush. Then he showed her around the property, pointing out the creek and the grazing lands, the vegetable garden that was struggling along without much care, and finally the inside of the house. The interior was clean but sparse, with furniture that was sturdy and functional but nothing decorative except a few photographs on the mantel. Clara wandered through the rooms, imagining what it could be like with curtains on the windows and rugs on the floors, with books on shelves and maybe paintings on the walls. In the kitchen, she noticed the cast iron stove and the pump for water and the large wooden table that could seat 8 or 10 people easily. "You do much cooking?" Clara asked. "Enough to survive," Thomas said, "though I will not pretend I am any good at it. Mostly I eat with the hands in the bunkhouse, or I make simple things. Beans, bacon, bread when I can get it from town. You bring me fresh bread every day, but you do not keep any for yourself." Thomas looked embarrassed. "I buy extra. 1 loaf for you, 1 for me. It seems worth it." Clara felt her heart expand in her chest. "You have been spending your money on bread for me every single day." "Best money I ever spent," Thomas said simply. Clara crossed the kitchen and took his hands in hers. "Thomas Barrett, you are the most extraordinary man I have ever met." He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist. "I want you to be happy, Clara. I want to give you everything you have been missing, not just bread. Everything." They kissed again, longer this time, and when they finally broke apart, Clara was breathing hard and Thomas looked dazed. "I should make us lunch," Clara said, needing something practical to focus on before she combusted entirely. "You do not have to do that. I want to. Please." Thomas showed her where everything was, and Clara set about making a simple meal from what she found in the larder. As she worked, Thomas sat at the table and watched her with such open admiration that she kept blushing and losing track of what she was doing. They ate together at the big table, and it felt so natural, so right, that Clara could almost imagine this was her home, her kitchen, her life. After lunch, they walked down to the creek and sat on the bank with their feet dangling in the cold, clear water. Thomas told her about growing up here, about learning to ride and rope from his father, about the dreams he had for expanding the ranch someday. Clara told him about her childhood in Missouri, about moving to Denver after her parents died, about the teaching position she had hoped to get before everything fell apart. "You could still teach," Thomas said. "Montrose needs a school teacher." The woman who was doing it moved away last spring, and they have not found anyone to replace her yet. "I do not have any formal training," Clara said. "Just a lot of reading and a desire to help children learn. That is more than most folks have. You should talk to the town council." "I know some of the members. I could put in a word." Clara looked at him, this man who kept opening doors she thought had closed forever. "Why are you so good to me?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over smooth stones. Finally, he said, "Because I am falling in love with you, Clara Zimmerman. I know it is too soon to say that. I know we have only known each other a couple of weeks. But it is the truth, and I have never been good at lying." Clara felt tears spill down her cheeks, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "It is not too soon," she said, "because I am falling in love with you too." They kissed by the creek with the sound of water flowing and birds singing, and Clara felt like her life was finally beginning again, like all the dark months had been leading her to this moment, to this man, to this future she could suddenly see stretching out before them bright and possible. Over the next few weeks, Clara and Thomas became inseparable whenever her work schedule allowed. Thomas still brought her bread every morning, but now he also brought wildflowers and little gifts he picked up in town, and once a book of poetry he had ordered special from Denver because she had mentioned loving poetry. Clara felt herself blossoming under his attention, felt herself becoming more fully herself than she had been in years. True to his word, Thomas spoke to the town council about Clara's interest in teaching, and they agreed to interview her. Clara prepared nervously, reviewing everything she could remember from her own education and making notes about how she would structure lessons. When the day of the interview came, Thomas waited outside the town hall, pacing like an expectant father, and when Clara emerged with a huge smile on her face, he picked her up and spun her around right there on the street. "I got it," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "I start in September when the fall term begins." "I knew you would," Thomas said, kissing her soundly and not caring who saw. That night, Thomas took her back to the hotel restaurant to celebrate, and after they ate, he reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Clara, I know this is fast. I know people will say we have not known each other long enough. But I am 30 years old and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You make me want to be better. You make me want to build something that lasts. I want to wake up every morning and bring you bread. I want to sit with you while you drink coffee and tell me about whatever book you are reading. I want to come home from the trail and find you there. I want everything with you." Clara felt her heart hammering. "Thomas, what are you saying?" He slid off his chair and knelt beside the table, pulling a small box from his pocket. Inside was a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest but beautiful. "I am saying marry me, Clara. Be my wife. Come live at the ranch and make it a home. Teach the children of Montrose and come back to me every evening. Build a life with me." Clara looked at this man who had noticed her saving Crusts and decided to do something about it. This man who had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. This man who had somehow become the center of her entire world in just a few short weeks. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Thomas, I will marry you." The restaurant erupted in applause from the other diners who had been watching, and Thomas slipped the ring on her finger and kissed her with such passion that Clara forgot they had an audience. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing and crying, the owner of the restaurant sent over champagne on the house, and the whole room toasted their happiness. They decided to marry quickly, not seeing any reason to wait. Clara had no family to invite, and neither did Thomas, except for his mother in California. And they both agreed they would rather start their life together sooner than spend months planning an elaborate ceremony. They set the date for mid-August, which gave them just 3 weeks to prepare but felt like an eternity to Clara, who now spent every free moment at the ranch helping Thomas get the house ready for her arrival. She sewed curtains from fabric purchased at the general store, using skills her mother had taught her years ago. She planted late-season flowers in the boxes on the porch and started planning a herb garden for next spring. She scrubbed and cleaned and rearranged furniture, and with every change, the house transformed from a bachelor's quarters into a real home. Thomas watched her work with such obvious adoration that Pete and Samuel teased him mercilessly, but he did not care. He was happier than he could ever remember being. The wedding took place on a Sunday afternoon in the small church in Montrose, with half the town in attendance because everyone loved a good love story, and the tale of the cowboy and the bread crusts had spread throughout the community. Clara wore a simple white dress that the seamstress had made for her, a wedding gift from Thomas, who would not hear of her wearing anything less than perfect. Thomas wore a new suit that made him look impossibly handsome, though he kept tugging at the collar and complaining that he could not breathe properly. When Clara walked down the aisle on the arm of Pete, who had volunteered to give her away, Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. She was beautiful, radiant, and she was choosing him, choosing this life, choosing their future together. When she reached him and took his hand, he had to blink back tears. The ceremony was short and sweet, with the preacher talking about love and commitment and the mysterious ways God brought people together. When he pronounced them husband and wife and Thomas kissed Clara, the entire church cheered. They walked back down the aisle together, officially Mr. and Mrs. Barrett, and climbed into the decorated buggy that Pete and Samuel had prepared, complete with tin cans tied to the back and a sign that read, "Just married." They drove to the ranch in golden afternoon sunshine, waving at people they passed on the road, and when they arrived home, Thomas carried Clara over the threshold of their house, their home, spinning her around in the front hallway until they were both dizzy and laughing. That night they came together as husband and wife, and it was tender and passionate, and everything Clara had hoped for. Thomas was gentle with her, patient, making sure she felt cherished and safe and desired. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Thomas's big bed that was now their bed, and talked in whispers about their dreams and hopes for the future. "I want children," Thomas said, trailing his fingers down Clara's bare arm. "Lots of them. This house is too big and quiet. I want it full of noise and chaos and little feet running everywhere." "How many is lots?" Clara asked, amused. "I do not know. 4, 5, as many as you want to give me." "That is a lot of children, Thomas Barrett. I know, but I missed having siblings growing up. I always wished for brothers and sisters. I want our kids to have that." Clara snuggled closer to him. "I want children too. I want to teach them and watch them grow and see what kind of people they become. I want to give them everything I did not have, everything my parents would have wanted for me." "We will," Thomas promised. "We will give them everything." September arrived, and with it the start of the school term. Clara was nervous her first day, standing in front of 23 children ranging in age from 6 to 14, all watching her with curious eyes. But she took a deep breath and introduced herself as Mrs. Barrett, and then she began to teach. She discovered she loved it even more than she had imagined, loved watching young minds grasp new concepts, loved seeing children excited about learning. She taught reading and writing, arithmetic and history, and tried to instill in all of them a love of knowledge that would serve them throughout their lives. Every day she came home to the ranch exhausted but happy, and every day Thomas was waiting for her, usually with some small disaster that made her laugh. The time he tried to cook dinner and nearly burned down the kitchen. The time one of the cows got loose and chased Pete around the corral. The time he fell off a horse for the first time in 20 years and had to admit to her that he had been showing off. Their life together was full of laughter and love and the 1,000 small moments that built a marriage. As autumn turned to winter and the Colorado mountains filled with snow, Clara discovered she was pregnant. She told Thomas one evening after supper, just placed his hand on her still flat stomach and said, "There is a baby in there." Thomas stared at her for a long moment, processing, and then he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared the horses. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully, worried he might hurt her or the baby. "We are having a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "In about 7 months," Clara said, laughing at his excitement. "So you have time to get used to the idea." But Thomas never really got used to the idea, not in the way that made him calm about it. He became almost comically overprotective, insisting Clara rest constantly, not let her lift anything heavy, worried about her riding in the buggy over rough roads. Clara bore his hovering with patient amusement, knowing it came from love, though she did have to occasionally put her foot down and remind him she was pregnant, not made of glass. She continued teaching through the winter, only stopping when she was 8 months along and could barely fit behind her desk anymore. The children had all been excited about their teacher's baby, and many of them brought small handmade gifts that Clara treasured. On her last day before her lying-in period, they threw her a small party, and several of the mothers from town came by to wish her well and offer advice. The baby came on a warm day in May 1879, after a labor that lasted 14 hours and left Clara exhausted but exhilarated. Thomas had paced holes in the kitchen floor while the midwife and 2 neighbor women attended Clara upstairs, and when he finally heard the baby's cry, he took the stairs 3 at a time. The midwife met him at the bedroom door with a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Barrett. A healthy, loud son." Thomas entered the room to find Clara propped up in bed, sweaty and pale but radiantly happy, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were still unfocused but might turn brown like his. He was perfect, miraculous, and Thomas felt his entire world shift on its axis. "Hello, little one," he whispered. "I am your papa." Clara smiled up at him. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names endlessly over the past months but never quite settled on anything. Now, looking at his son, Thomas said, "What about James? After my father, James Barrett," Clara said, testing it out. "I like it, James Thomas Barrett, with my name as his middle name. Why not? You are going to be his hero. He should carry your name." Thomas bent down and kissed Clara gently. "Thank you for him. Thank you for everything." Baby James was indeed loud, as the midwife had noted, but he was also sweet and surprisingly easygoing between his demands for food. Clara took to motherhood with the same determination she brought to everything else, though she was exhausted in a way she had never experienced. Thomas helped as much as he could, walking James at night when he was fussy, changing diapers without complaint, and gazing at his son with such obvious adoration that Clara sometimes had to look away, because the love in the room was almost too much to bear. When James was 3 months old, Clara returned to teaching, bringing the baby with her to school since she was still nursing. The children were enchanted with baby James, and the older girls helped watch him during their breaks, giving Clara brief reprieves to focus on lessons. It was chaotic and unconventional, but it worked for them, and Clara loved that her son would grow up in a schoolhouse surrounded by learning. The years flowed by in a blur of happiness and hard work. Thomas continued his cattle drives, though he shortened them when he could to spend more time at home. The ranch prospered under his capable management, and they were able to hire more hands and expand their herds. Clara taught during the school terms and spent summers at the ranch, tending her ever-growing garden and chasing after James, who proved to be as adventurous as his father. When James was 2, Clara became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth after Clara's mother. Elizabeth was quieter than James had been, with Clara's green eyes and a serious expression that made Thomas call her his little philosopher. 2 years after that came another son, Matthew, who was loud and boisterous and kept them all on their toes. And 2 years after that, twin girls arrived unexpectedly, and they named them Sarah and Rose, and suddenly their house was full of noise and chaos and love, exactly as Thomas had wanted. The children grew up wild and happy on the ranch, learning to ride almost before they could walk, helping with chores as soon as they were able, and attending school where their mother taught them alongside the other children of Montrose. James grew tall like his father, serious and responsible, clearly being groomed to take over the ranch someday. Elizabeth loved books as much as Clara and announced at age 8 that she wanted to be a teacher too. Matthew was the jokester, always getting into harmless trouble and making everyone laugh. The twins were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and speaking in their own secret language that no one else could understand. Thomas and Clara watched their family grow with hearts full of gratitude. They had hard times, certainly. There were years when the cattle prices dropped and money was tight. There were illnesses and injuries, like the time James broke his arm falling from a horse, and the time Elizabeth had scarlet fever that terrified them all for weeks. There were arguments and disagreements, because no marriage is perfect, but they always came back together, always remembered what they had built and why. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Clara back to the hotel restaurant where they had celebrated their engagement and where he had proposed. The children were staying overnight with Pete and Samuel, who despite their advanced age still worked at the ranch and had become beloved uncles to all the Barrett children. Thomas and Clara dressed in their finest clothes and sat at the same table by the window, and Thomas ordered steak and potatoes and fresh bread with butter, just like that first time. "You remember when I told you that you would get used to having enough food again?" Thomas asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. Clara smiled. "I remember everything about that night. I have never regretted a single moment since," Thomas said. "Marrying you was the best decision I ever made, even when Matthew put that snake in your boot." "Even then," Thomas laughed, "though I could have done without that particular adventure." They talked through dinner about everything and nothing, reminiscing about the past decade, marveling at how much had changed and how much had stayed the same. They were older now, with gray beginning to thread through Thomas's hair and lines around Clara's eyes from years of smiling, but the love between them had only deepened with time. After dinner, they walked through the now familiar streets of Montrose hand in hand. The town had grown over the years, with new buildings and new businesses and new families moving in. Clara had taught probably 100 children by now, and everywhere they went people greeted them warmly, these pillars of their small community. "Are you happy, Clara?" Thomas asked, as they paused beneath the same cottonwood tree where they had first kissed all those years ago. Clara looked up at her husband, at this man who had noticed she saved bread crusts and decided to do something about it, who had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return, who had loved her fiercely and faithfully for 10 years. "I am more than happy," she said. "I am blessed. I have everything I ever dreamed of and so much more." "Me too," Thomas said, pulling her close. "You know, I still think about that day in the saloon sometimes, about how close I came to not saying anything, to just minding my own business and walking away. What if I had not brought you that first loaf of bread?" "But you did," Clara said. "You chose kindness. You chose me, and I chose you back. That is all that matters." They kissed beneath the cottonwood tree, just like they had a decade earlier, and Clara felt the same flutter in her chest, the same sense of rightness and belonging. Some things never changed, and she was grateful for that. The years continued to pass, marked by the milestones of their growing children. James turned 18 and took on more responsibility at the ranch, proving himself as capable as his father. Elizabeth graduated from school and began teaching alongside Clara, bringing new energy and ideas to the classroom. Matthew decided he wanted to be a veterinarian and started studying with the local animal doctor. The twins, always surprising everyone, developed a talent for music and began performing at church and community gatherings. Through it all, Thomas and Clara remained the steady center of their family, their love the foundation on which everything else was built. They still had their morning routine, even after all these years. Thomas would come into the kitchen where Clara was making breakfast, and he would wrap his arms around her from behind and kiss her neck, and she would lean back against him and feel grateful for another day together. They still went on dates, usually to that same hotel restaurant, making time to be just husband and wife rather than parents or teachers or ranchers. They still talked for hours about everything, still laughed at each other's jokes, still supported each other through challenges and celebrated victories together. When they had been married for 20 years, their children threw them a surprise anniversary party at the ranch. By then, James was 21 and courting a sweet girl from town. Elizabeth was 19 and had become the head teacher after Clara had stepped back to part-time. Matthew was 17 and had been accepted to study veterinary medicine in Denver. The twins were 15 and already drawing attention from every young man in the county, much to Thomas's dismay. The party was held in the barn, which the children had decorated with flowers and lanterns, and half the town showed up to celebrate the Barretts. People gave speeches about what Thomas and Clara meant to the community, about how their love story had become a sort of legend in Montrose, inspiring others to believe in kindness and second chances, and the power of noticing someone who needed help. Thomas stood up to give a speech, and Clara watched him with the same admiration she had felt on their first date. His hair was mostly gray now, and he moved a little slower than he used to, but to her, he was still the handsome cowboy who had brought her bread every morning. 20 years ago, Thomas began, I saw a young woman saving bread crusts in a saloon, and something about that simple act broke my heart and opened it at the same time. I decided to bring her fresh bread, not because I wanted anything from her, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. I had no idea that small gesture would change my entire life. Clara, you have given me everything. 5 beautiful children, a home full of love and laughter, a purpose beyond just working and surviving. You made me want to be better, and you have made me happy every single day for 20 years. I love you more now than I did on our wedding day, and I will love you more tomorrow than I do today. Thank you for choosing me. Thank you for building this life with me. There was not a dry eye in the barn, including Clara's. She stood up and went to her husband, wrapped her arms around him, and kissed him in front of everyone. Thank you for noticing me, she whispered against his lips. Thank you for the bread. Thank you for everything. The party went late into the night, with music and dancing and so much food that Clara laughed and said they had come full circle from those days when she saved crusts. Their children danced together, and Thomas and Clara waltzed slowly in the center of the barn, surrounded by their community, their family, their life. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Clara stood on the porch of their home and looked out at the ranch that had become hers in every sense of the word. The house where they had raised their children, the land where they had built their life, the mountains standing eternal in the distance. She thought about the scared, hungry young woman she had been when she arrived in Montrose, and she thought about the woman she was now, confident and loved and so deeply happy. Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "About how far we have come," Clara said. "About how none of this was what I planned, but it is so much better than anything I could have imagined." "I was just thinking the same thing," Thomas said. "Though I have to admit, my back is starting to hurt from all that dancing. I am not 20 anymore." Clara laughed and turned in his arms. "You are 50, which is not old. It is not young either. I do not care how old you are, I will love you when you are 60 and 70 and 100. 100, huh? That is ambitious. We Barretts are stubborn. We will probably live forever just to spite anyone who doubts us." Thomas grinned and kissed her. "I like the sound of that, growing old with you." Becoming one of those couples who have been married so long they start to look alike and finish each other's sentences. We already finish each other's sentences, Clara pointed out. Fair point. They stood together on the porch as the last of the party guests departed, waving goodbye and calling out thanks. When everyone was gone, and the ranch was quiet except for the sounds of horses in the stable and the creek babbling in the distance, Thomas took Clara's hand and led her inside their home, up the stairs to their bedroom, where they made love with the tenderness and familiarity of 2 decades together. Afterward, lying in the darkness with Clara's head on his chest, Thomas said, "I never told you this, but the morning I first brought you bread, I almost did not do it. I stood outside your door for probably 5 minutes, telling myself it was weird, that you would think I was strange, that I should just mind my own business. But then I thought about you wrapping those crusts so carefully, and I could not walk away. I had to do something." Clara propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "I am glad you did not walk away. I am glad you chose to be kind. That kindness saved me in more ways than you know. I was so lost back then, so alone. You gave me hope again. You gave me purpose," Thomas said. "Before you, I was just going through the motions. Working, coming home, working again. I was not unhappy, but I was not really happy either. You made everything matter more. You made me want to build something lasting." "We did build something lasting," Clara said. "Look at our children. Look at this life. We created something beautiful together." "We did," Thomas agreed. "And we are not done yet. We have grandchildren to look forward to, more years together, more memories to make." "I cannot wait," Clara said, and she meant it with her whole heart. True to Thomas's prediction, grandchildren began arriving a few years later. James married his sweetheart and gave them a grandson named Thomas Jr., much to Thomas's delight and embarrassment. Elizabeth married a fellow teacher she met at a conference in Denver, and they had twin boys who were just as inseparable as Sarah and Rose had been. Matthew eventually returned from his veterinary studies with a wife he had met in the city, and they settled in Montrose to start an animal clinic, giving Thomas and Clara 2 granddaughters who loved helping their father with the animals. The ranch house, already large, seemed to shrink with all the grandchildren running through it during family gatherings. Thomas had a special chair in the living room where he would sit and tell stories to any grandchild who would listen. Tales of cattle drives and wild horses and the early days of Montrose. Clara would watch him from across the room, knitting or mending, her heart full to bursting with love for this man and the family they had created. Sarah and Rose, the twins, both married in a double wedding when they were 22, and they each built homes near the ranch so their children could grow up together just as they had. The Barrett family was becoming a dynasty in Montrose, known for their integrity, their hard work, and the deep love that bound them all together. Thomas retired from cattle driving when he turned 60, finally admitting that the long months on the trail were too hard on his aging body. But he did not really retire from the ranch, just shifted his focus to managing rather than the hard physical labor. James had taken over most of the day-to-day operations by then anyway, proving himself more than capable. Thomas spent his days checking on the herds, mending fences, and spoiling his ever-growing number of grandchildren. Clara continued teaching until she was 65, finally stepping down to let the younger generation take over entirely. Elizabeth had become an excellent head teacher, bringing in new methods and ideas while maintaining the values Clara had instilled. On Clara's last day of teaching, the entire town turned out to honor her, recognizing the impact she had made on literally hundreds of children over her 40-plus years in the classroom. At the ceremony, the mayor gave a speech about Clara's contributions to Montrose, about how she had arrived as a young woman with nothing and had given everything to their community. He presented her with a plaque and a scholarship fund that had been established in her name to help children from poor families continue their education. Clara wept as she accepted it, overwhelmed by the outpouring of love and gratitude. In her retirement, Clara discovered she loved having time to just be. She gardened extensively, turning the area around the ranch house into a showplace of flowers and vegetables. She read voraciously, finally having time to work through the stacks of books that had been accumulating for years. She spent time with Thomas, just the two of them again after all these years of children and chaos, and she found she loved this phase of their life just as much as all the others. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands and talking quietly about everything and nothing. Sometimes their children and grandchildren would visit, filling the house with noise and energy, and Thomas and Clara would smile at each other across the chaos, remembering when their own children had been that young. Other times, it was just the two of them, and that was good too, precious even. On their 30th anniversary, Thomas surprised Clara with a trip. He had arranged everything with their children, who would watch the ranch, and he took her on the train to California to visit his mother, who was now quite elderly but still sharp as a tack. They spent 2 weeks in San Francisco, seeing sights Clara had only read about, eating in fancy restaurants and walking along the ocean. It was a second honeymoon of sorts, and they loved every minute of it. On the train ride back to Colorado, watching the landscape roll by, Clara said, "Do you remember that first morning when I caught you leaving bread for me?" Thomas laughed. "I thought I was going to die of embarrassment. You were so sweet, trying to explain why you did it. You said it was not charity, it was just being human." "I still believe that," Thomas said. "Kindness is not charity, it is just recognizing ourselves in other people and acting accordingly." "You taught me that," Clara said. "You taught me that there are still good people in the world, people who notice when someone is struggling and who do something about it without expecting anything in return." "You taught me things too," Thomas said. "You taught me what it means to really share your life with someone, to build something together that is bigger than either person alone. You taught me about love that lasts, that grows stronger instead of fading." Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. "We have been very lucky." "We have," Thomas agreed. "And I am grateful for every single day." They returned to Montrose and settled back into their life, surrounded by family and friends, embedded in the community they had helped build. Thomas was 70 now, moving slower and complaining good-naturedly about his creaky joints. Clara was 67, her hair completely white but her eyes still bright and alert. They were growing old together, just as they had promised, and it was everything they had hoped it would be. One morning, as they sat drinking coffee just as they had done for over 30 years, Clara said, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if we had never met? If you had not noticed me that day in the saloon?" Thomas considered this. "I try not to. It is too sad to imagine. My life would have been so much emptier. No you, no children, no grandchildren, just work and loneliness. I do not want to think about that version of my life." "I think about it sometimes," Clara admitted. "Not because I want to, but because it makes me appreciate this more. I was in such a dark place when I arrived here. I did not know how I was going to survive. And then you appeared with your bread and your kindness, and everything changed. You saved me, Thomas." "You saved me too," Thomas said. "Maybe we saved each other. Maybe we did." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching the morning sun climb higher in the sky. Finally, Thomas said, "I want you to know something. When I am gone, when this life is over, my last thought is going to be of you. Of this. of everything we built together. I could not have asked for a better life or a better partner." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. "Do not talk about being gone. We are going to live forever, remember," Thomas smiled. "Right, 100 years old at least. At least." But they both knew that forever was not really possible, that their time together, as wonderful as it had been, would eventually come to an end. They did not dwell on it, did not let it overshadow the present, but they held each other a little tighter, cherished each moment a little more, and made sure to say "I love you" every single day. The years continued to pass peacefully. More grandchildren arrived, and then great-grandchildren, until Thomas and Clara lost count of exactly how many descendants they had. The ranch remained in the family, passed down to James and then to his son Thomas Jr., each generation adding their own touches while maintaining the core values that Thomas and Clara had established. The house they had made a home became a gathering place for the extended Barrett family, a place where love was always abundant and everyone was welcome. When Thomas was 75, he had a mild heart attack that scared them all, but that he recovered from, with Clara nursing him back to health. The doctor told him to take it easy, to rest more and work less, and Thomas grumbled about it but complied because he wanted as many more years with Clara as he could get. He spent his days on the porch in his favorite chair, watching the ranch operations from a distance and giving advice when asked. Clara stayed by his side constantly during his recovery, reading to him from the books they both loved, reminding him of memories from their decades together, and holding his hand while he napped. Their children worried about her wearing herself out, but Clara insisted she was fine, that taking care of Thomas was not a burden but a privilege. He had taken care of her for their entire marriage. Now it was her turn. Thomas recovered well, and they had several more good years together. They celebrated their 40th anniversary, surrounded by what felt like 100 family members. Multiple generations of Barretts all gathered to honor the couple who had started it all. Thomas and Clara sat at the head of a long table laden with food, looking out at the faces of their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they marveled at what they had created. 40 years, Thomas said to Clara, raising his glass. 40 years of waking up next to you. 40 years of coffee and conversation. 40 years of laughter and love. It has been the greatest gift of my life. To 40 more, Clara said, clinking her glass against his, and everyone cheered, even though they all knew that was not realistic. But they got 5 more years. 5 more years of mornings on the porch and evenings watching the sunset. 5 more years of family gatherings and quiet moments alone. 5 more years of being Thomas and Clara, the cowboy and his love, the foundation of the Barrett family. And then, on a quiet spring morning much like the one when their son James had been born, Thomas died peacefully in his sleep with Clara beside him. Clara woke to find him gone, his hand still warm in hers, a peaceful expression on his face. She did not cry immediately, just sat with him for a long time, memorizing his features one last time, thanking him for everything, for the bread and the kindness and the decades of love. When she finally called for their children, her voice was steady, because she knew Thomas would not want her to fall apart. He would want her to be strong, to celebrate what they had had rather than mourn what was gone. The funeral was enormous, with people coming from all over Colorado to pay their respects to Thomas Barrett. The stories people told painted a picture of a man who was kind and fair, hardworking and honest, devoted to his family and his community. But Clara knew the real Thomas, the man who noticed small things and cared deeply, who brought bread to a stranger and fell in love with her, who built a life of meaning and purpose one day at a time. After the funeral, After everyone had gone home and the ranch was quiet again, Clara sat on the porch in Thomas's chair and let herself cry. She cried for all the mornings they would not share, for all the conversations they would not have, for the empty space in their bed and in her heart. But she also felt grateful, so deeply grateful for 45 years of marriage, for 5 children and numerous grandchildren and great-grandchildren, for a love that had sustained her and shaped her and made her life infinitely richer than she could have ever imagined. In the months that followed, Clara discovered that grief and gratitude could coexist. She missed Thomas desperately, felt his absence like a physical ache, but she also felt him everywhere. In the house they had made together, in the faces of their descendants, in the garden she had planted and he had praised. He was gone, but he was also still there, woven into the very fabric of her life. Clara lived for another 7 years, remaining sharp and active until the very end. She spent her time with family, continuing to garden, still reading voraciously, and serving as the matriarch of the ever-expanding Barrett clan. She told stories about Thomas to anyone who would listen, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had not known him as well. She made sure everyone knew about the bread, about how a simple act of kindness had sparked a love story that spanned nearly 5 decades and created a legacy that would last for generations. On what would have been their 52nd anniversary, Clara went to sleep in the bed she had shared with Thomas and did not wake up. Her children found her in the morning, peaceful and still, with a slight smile on her face. On her bedside table was a worn piece of paper, carefully preserved, with handwriting they all recognized as their father's. "Everyone deserves fresh bread." They buried Clara next to Thomas in the cemetery overlooking Montrose, with a headstone that read Clara Zimmerman Barrett, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and teacher, 1856–1925. At her funeral, Elizabeth read a letter Clara had written to be opened after her death. In it, Clara thanked her children for the joy they had brought her, told them how proud she was of the people they had become, and reminded them that kindness was the most powerful force in the world. She ended the letter with a story about a hungry young woman saving bread crusts and a cowboy who decided to do something about it, and how that single moment of compassion had created everything they all now had. "Never underestimate the power of noticing someone," Clara had written. "Never underestimate what can grow from a single act of kindness. Your father taught me that, and it is the most important lesson I can pass on to you. See people. Really see them, and when you see someone who needs help, do something about it. You never know what might grow from that small seed of kindness." The Barrett family took those words to heart, and the tradition of kindness continued down through the generations. The ranch remained in the family, a reminder of what Thomas and Clara had built. Their descendants continued to live in and around Montrose, contributing to the community, raising their families with the values Thomas and Clara had instilled. And every year on the anniversary of Thomas and Clara's wedding, the entire Barrett clan would gather at the ranch for a celebration that always included fresh bread with butter, in honor of the humble beginning of their family's love story. The story of the cowboy and the bread crusts became a cherished family legend, told and retold to each new generation, a reminder that the greatest love stories often begin with the smallest acts of kindness, that noticing someone's struggle and choosing to help can change not just one life, but create ripples that extend far into the future. Thomas Barrett had noticed Clara Zimmerman saving crusts, and he had made sure she had fresh bread daily from then on. That simple decision had created a love that lasted a lifetime, a family that spanned generations, and a legacy of kindness that would never be forgotten. In the Barrett family, They would say that love was not just a feeling but an action, not just words but deeds, and it all started with bread, with seeing someone who needed help and deciding to be the one who helped. Thomas and Clara's story was proof that the most extraordinary lives could begin in the most ordinary moments. That magic existed in paying attention, in caring, in choosing to act when it would be easier to walk away. And in Montrose, Colorado, as the years turned into decades and then into a century, the name Barrett remained synonymous with kindness, with love, with the idea that one person really could make a difference in another person's life. And that difference could echo through time in ways neither of them could have ever imagined when it all began with crusts and bread and a cowboy who cared.